Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Patricia Chighi. I am an international law practitioner with previous hands-on experience working with governments and non-state actors. Welcome to our panel, The Sustainable Development Goals 10 Years On. As we mark a decade since the adoption of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, it's an important moment to pause and to take stock not only of the progress made, but also of the profound disruptions that have reshaped our world in recent years, from the climate emergency to public health crisis and rising geopolitical tensions and economic inequalities. The global landscape has changed in ways that few could have predicted back in 2015. And so these converging crises challenge us to rethink the pathways towards sustainable development. Incremental progress is no longer enough. And so today's discussion asks the central question: what crisis-driven changes are needed now, and who should lead them? Our panel brings together scholars and practitioners who are examining these topics, and I will go ahead and introduce them now. We have Dr. Freya Doughty Wagner. And I apologize for butchering your names. Freya is the Chief Operating Officer of the American Branch of International Law Association, on the organizing committee for this conference, and North American Director for the Global Network of Human Rights and the Environment. Professor Giovanna Gismonti is a visiting associate professor of law and environmental law fellow at the George Washington University Law School. And Professor John Knox is the Henry Lauerman, thank you, Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University. And he's also a former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment. Unfortunately, Professor Vanessa Racehorse is not able to join us today, but she has sent a few notes that I will attempt my very best to share with you. So for the next hour, I will be asking the panelists questions, and they will each have 7 to 10 minutes to answer. And we will leave time at the end for questions from the audience. We hope this conversation sparks not only the critical reflection, but also actionable ideas for transforming systems, institutions, and mindset in the decisive years ahead. Let's begin. Freya, first question goes to you. When it comes to goals 2, 3, and 6, which cover zero hunger, good health and well-being, and clean water and sanitation, which are the most often cited as key secondary sources to bolster arguments regarding states' failure to meet certain climate and health-based thresholds. Are we on track to meet these goals for our youth and future generations?
Okay, the short answer is no. The long answer is I will start by talking about target 2 or goal 2, zero hunger. So target 2 point, is this working? Are we here? I will just speak loudly. Target 2.2, quote, achieving by 2025 the international agreed targets on stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age and addressing the nutritional needs of adolescent girls. Target 2.2's indicators are the prevalence of stunting among children under 5 years of age, the prevalence of malnutrition by type, wasting, and being overweight among children under 5 years of age, and the prevalence of anemia in women under 15 to 49. Child wasting and stunting numbers are declining, but not as fast as was hoped by this target, and anemia in children and women aged 15 to 49 has remained stagnant. Evidently, Goal 2's ambitions are not being met. Goal 3 has 5 targets for pertinent for children and youth. Target 3.2, quote, to end preventable deaths of newborns and children under 5 years of age, with all countries aiming to reduce neonatal mortality to at least as low as 12 per 1,000 live births, and under 5 mortality to at least as low as 25 per 1,000 live births. Extreme weather events are linked to an increase in maternal and neonatal mortality. The leading causes of death in children are still primarily pneumonia, diarrhea, and malaria, all diseases worsened by climate change. As of 2021, the global average for neonatal deaths is 18 per 1,000 live births, and for under 5, 38 deaths per 1,000 live births. It is nigh impossible to reach target 3.2 by 2030. If these aims are what United Nations member states believe are required to reach the highest attainable standard of health for children, then this aspect of goal 3 is sadly another failure. Target 3.9 aims to substantially reduce the number of deaths and illnesses from hazardous chemicals in air, water, and soil pollution and contamination by 2030 again. This is measured by tracking the mortality rate attributed to air pollution, exposure to unsafe water, and lack of hygiene, and unintentional poisoning. The impacts of air pollution and unsafe water and sanitation sources are pretty widely studied. It has impacts from asthma to cholera. Climate change is unequivocally making children ill. Indoor and outdoor air pollution cause myriad diseases, including lung cancer and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, resulting in the death of 3.4 million children per year. Household air pollution alone, from open fires, inefficient stoves, and coal, was responsible for over 237,000 deaths of children under 5 years every single year. Ambient particulate matter, APM, is the primary cause of air pollution, illness and death, and total deaths from outdoor particulate matter, indoor air pollution, and outdoor ozone pollution have been declining since 1990, from 156 to 85.6 deaths per 100,000 people. However, deaths from APM remain largely unchanged, 53.2 deaths per 100,000 in 1990 to 52.7 deaths per 100,000 in 2019. This is not the substantial reduction target 3.9 asks. Children need an urgent remedy to fix the APM problem and the resulting needless illness and premature death of young people at the hands of major emitters. And lastly, target 3.6. The goal by 2030 was to improve water quality by reducing pollution and the dumping of hazardous waste, and to halve the proportion of untreated wastewater. Globally, there are an estimated 2 billion children aged 0 to 14 years old, over half of which lack access to safe sanitation, and over a quarter lack access to safely managed water. Wastewater, water contaminated through domestic or industrial processes containing waste products and harmful chemicals, must be professionally treated to be released safely back into the environment. Wastewater production varies significantly by country and by financial status. Just over 15% of the global population in high-income countries produce 41% of the global wastewater. Presently, 48% of total wastewater released into the environment is untreated. It was previously thought that this statistic was closer to 8%, so whilst a far more optimistic result, challenges still remain. Treating wastewater requires advanced, expensive technologies, a system unaffordable for many developing countries and who are most in need of this infrastructure. Untreated wastewater directly contributes towards deadly diarrheal diseases, overwhelmingly impacting children under 5. To achieve target 6.3, radical change is required. As with many aspects of climate change, the major emerging states are not those feeling the immediate and most devastating consequences of their damaging actions. Child climate litigants, which is my particular specialty, especially in the least developed and developing nations, should be conscious of the Sustainable Development Goals, their fundamental right to the highest attainable standard of health, and the disproportionate burden they shoulder. Some litigants have pushed for negative actions, asking for the court to request that companies lower their emissions, partially by reducing their emitting conduct. The SDGs require both positive and negative obligations. Target 6.3 success is dependent on enforced positive obligations. Developed states and fossil fuel industries paying for wastewater treatment facilities in the least developed and developing nations. In seeking positive obligations, the SDGs will be a crucial secondary source for climate change litigants. They're not cited nearly as often as I think they should be because they're so universally understood. But as we see an increase in child climate litigation, I think we'll really see an increase in citing the SDGs. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Freya. And speaking on climate litigation, the next question is for Professor Gismondi. In what ways do recent jurisprudential decisions and advisory opinions, especially within the inter-American human rights system, advance the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically of SDG 13 on climate action.
Yeah, thank you very much. Does it work? Okay, hello, yes. So my analysis centers on the Inter-American human rights system and its contribution to climate change litigation. And I have to start with the assertion that during the last years, the Inter-American human rights system, and in particular, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, has taken very important steps to protect the right to a healthy environment. In particular, advisory opinion number 23 of 2017 was groundbreaking because it was the first time an international court that protects human rights, and in general, an international court, not only asserted the existence of the right to a healthy environment, but also gave content to the right to a healthy environment in a way that no other court has given in the past. And I think that the right to a healthy environment has the potential to fulfill the goals under the Paris Agreement and the climate change goals. So we begin with the advisory opinion number 23 of 2017 and the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. And then we follow with the Laca-Honhat versus Argentina case decided in 2020, where the court reaffirmed in this is the first contentious case of the Inter-American Court, where the court affirmed the existence of the right to a healthy environment. And then again in La Oroya versus Peru, the court reaffirmed the right to a healthy environment and issued remedial measures that had no precedent in the past. And in my view, the remedial measures issued in La Oroya versus Peru will have an impact in future climate change litigation. And then more recently, advisory opinion number 32 on human rights and climate change further protect human rights in the context of environmental degradation. Let me give you a little more content about the right to a healthy environment, which I think will give a tool to future plaintiffs or claimants to pursue climate change litigation within the Inter-American human rights system. This new right to a healthy environment is asserted for the first time as an autonomous right, which in the view of the court applies extraterritorially. And I think that that's a very important recognition of the court, which will allow future claimants that are not within the territory of the state to claim that the right to a healthy environment was violated, even though they are outside the territory of the state. And this is a very important component in a climate change litigation, where more likely climate change affects not only individuals within the territory, but also outside the territory. And it is also important to note that the court has stated that the right to a healthy environment applies extraterritorially, not only in its advisory opinion of 2017, but also in its advisory opinion of 2025 of this year. So it's reaffirming the extraterritoriality of this new right and groundbreaking right of the right to a healthy environment. Another aspect of the right to a healthy environment, which I think will help and support climate change litigation, is that the right to a healthy environment, as of course, protects nature. So in the view of the court in La Oroya versus Peru, the court stated that the right to a healthy environment affords protection to forests, rivers, air, which is significant in climate change litigation. And the court articulated international environmental standards in La Oroya versus Peru, where the court stated that the right to a healthy environment afford protection to present and future generations, as well as raises the obligation of the state to take preventive measures to avoid irreversible environmental harm. So if we were to take those components of the right to a healthy environment as recognized by the court, meaning intergenerational equity, preventive measures, protection of nature, extraterritoriality, I think that the court is framing a notion that will allow future climate change litigation. In addition to the new and groundbreaking right to a healthy environment, the court has made that requirement of causation flexible, in that claimants do not need to prove causation anymore. In La Oroya versus Peru, the court emphasized the failures of the state to prevent massive air pollution as engaging the liability of the state. It is stated that proving direct or immediate causation was not longer required. The court today is emphasizing the failures of the state rather than direct causation between the source of the harm and the injury claimed by claimants. And finally, the remedial framework in La Oroya versus Peru can also help climate change litigation in the court is expanding its remedial framework. The court is no longer limited to order, let's say, remediation of lands, and it happened with the case law of Indigenous peoples, where the court will order remediation of lands and compensation to the victims, but instead, today the court is adopting innovative environmental orders, like adjust your maximum permissible levels to match international maximum permissible levels. So it's ordering the state to adjust its environmental laws in accordance to international environmental laws. And finally, in La Oroya versus Peru, the court ordered the state to improve not only to remediate the lands that had been polluted for almost 100 years, but also to improve the general environment of the region. And it considered the environment as a system. So obviously, the court is now ordering broader measures that extend beyond the land that was polluted or contaminated. It's ordering to improve the quality of the environment as a system. So I think that putting together all these innovations in terms of substantive contribution, procedural contribution, and remedial contribution, I think that the court is setting the foundation for future climate change litigation, in my view.
Thank you, Professor Chismongi. And next question is for Professor Knox. And we're remaining on the topic of SDG 13, again on climate action. How does the July 2025 advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change obligations advance the objective of SDG 13 on climate action?
Is this okay? Can you hear me okay? This is the
Yeah,
difficulty we're all having, I guess. Hello.
No, maybe I stand up. I've had so long, it's very hard for me to do anything without standing up. It's like my vocal cords is not connected to my feet or something. So so I'm just kind of gonna build on what you've already heard about that Giovanna already told you about the Inter-American Court. I'm going to kind of pick up the story with the International Court of Justice. I would say there's kind of good news and bad news in this respect, especially with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. When I teach the Sustainable Development Goals in my International Environmental Law class, one question I always ask is basically, what are they as a matter of law? Are they somehow legally binding? Are they not legally binding? If they're not legally binding, what good are they? And the ICJ advisory opinion in some ways is kind of illustrative, I think, of how little actual legal work the Sustainable Development Goals do. Sustainable Development Goals were barely mentioned, I think, by most of the participants in the litigation, and in the opinion itself, they don't come up at all. The opinion does spend one paragraph on the principle of sustainable development as a principle, but that principle itself isn't really clearly doing much work as far as the legal analysis of the court is concerned. That's kind of the bad news if you're hoping that the SDGs have some kind of legal normative weight in settings like this. On the other hand, the good news is the opinion very much does advance the principles themselves of the principle of sustainable development and SDG 13 in particular. If you don't already know the story behind the ICJ advisory opinion, just a couple of sentences on that, because it's quite inspiring. It started as a result of a group of students at the University of the South Pacific that basically were thinking of what they could do to try and actually advance the effort to do something about climate change. They were understandably frustrated at how little seemed to be happening, and they had the idea, what if we could take a case to the International Court of Justice? This may seem like a long shot at best, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. They started a campaign in 2019, they got Vanuatu on board, and by 2023, they had so much support that the General Assembly decided by consensus to refer this question as an advisory opinion to the ICJ, that is to request the advisory opinion, to request the ICJ to issue an advisory opinion on the obligations of states with respect to climate change. It's a long, detailed, and very interesting opinion. Let me just kind of summarize it as quickly as I can. Essentially, at the outset, there were two big issues. The big emitters pretty much all took the position that the only really relevant law was the law expressed in the climate agreements, especially the Paris Agreement. This is the lex specialis argument, right? There's special law on this, therefore you can ignore everything else that might apply. Oh, and also their second argument was, by the way, that the agreements, including the Paris Agreement, the most important climate agreement adopted in 2015, they don't actually require states to do anything. So we win, checkmate. The ICJ actually rejected both of those arguments quite strongly. To take them in reverse order, it said actually the Paris Agreement does constrain what states have, what discretion states have to decide for themselves what to do. States have committed to present nationally determined contributions, and those contributions have to reflect their highest possible ambition, and they have to do everything they can actually to carry out the commitments they made. Moreover, collectively, the ICJ said, those commitments have to add up to the target set by the Paris Agreement itself of holding global increase in average temperature to no more than 1.5 degrees. That was interesting in itself because the Paris Agreement doesn't actually say 1.5 degrees in such clear, stark terms, but the ICJ said, applying treaty interpretation principles reflected in the Vienna Convention, that basically states had said so clearly after the Paris Agreement that 1.5 degrees had to be the target, that in fact had become the proper interpretation of the Paris Agreement. So in other words, the ICJ said, yeah, not only does the Paris Agreement actually have substantive content, it requires you collectively to meet this 1.5 degree target. Second, and again, this is kind of in reverse order of how I first presented the issues, the ICJ said, and that's not the only source of internationally binding obligations on new states. Customary international law also sets out obligations. The law of the sea sets out obligations, and human rights law sets out obligations. I'm not going to go through all of that. Again, it's very interesting. Very briefly, customary international law, the ICJ said, it's a little bit ambiguous language, but I'm gonna perhaps oversimplify it by saying that essentially they said it sets basically the same standard as the Paris Agreement. That is, even if you're not a party to the Paris Agreement, hello, United States, you are still bound by the obligation, a stringent obligation of due diligence to do everything you can to actually reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. With respect to human rights law, it's really remarkable language. I mean, it's not, I think, it doesn't go quite as far as the Inter-American Court, but no other court, as you said, has gone as far as that. But for the ICJ to go as far, much more conservative court historically, is pretty remarkable. It said both that states have obligations to protect human rights from the effects of climate change, and also it said that the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is part of international law. This is a right that the United Nations level was only recognized in a General Assembly resolution in 2022. Many states, certainly including the United States, said at the time, hey, by the way, we don't mean that this changes international law. We just are holding this up as kind of a political aspiration. The ICJ said, oh, actually, we think it is part of international law, and so you're bound by that too. That's all really remarkable stuff. Having said that, there are a couple of weaknesses, one internal and one external to the opinion I just want to kind of point out. One is the internal weaknesses. The opinion, despite all of the great things it did, it really was pretty quiet on exactly how you're supposed to determine individual state responsibility for the failure to collectively meet this 1.5 degree target, which, let's be clear about, is almost certain to fail to be met. That is, we are already, 2024 was already over 1.5 degrees because of the way we measure this in a long-term measurement. We're kind of between 1.35 and 1.4 degrees, but the idea that we're going to suddenly reverse course would require us to start dropping annual greenhouse gas emissions by 5% a year between now and the next 10 years. That's very, very unlikely to happen. So the court didn't really give much guidance on what happens when that target is not met. Which states are going to be responsible to which states for how much. Instead, it said that's got to be left to future in concreto, in the court's repeated language, determination. And that's the second weakness, the external weakness. You can't blame this on the court, but the fact is the states that have historically been the biggest contributors or the states that are currently the biggest contributors are also the states that are the least likely to pay attention to this ICJ opinion. The United States, other Western European states, China, maybe some Western European states will pay attention to it, but the US, China are just not. India, Russia, Japan, these are the biggest emitters in the world currently. It seems very unlikely that these future in concreto determinations that the court kind of anticipates are actually going to take place in ways that necessarily bind them. So that's the bad news. Still, though, I do want to leave on kind of a positive note. This does reflect, I think, the kind of rising tide of climate litigation and often rights-based climate litigation. So while this by itself is not going to solve all problems by any means, it certainly provides a workable, detailed framework within which now lower courts at the national and the regional levels are going to continue to operate. And I just want to kind of give a shout out. I think the ICJ really rose to the moment. This opinion was unanimous, which is a remarkable thing to say about an ICJ opinion under any circumstances, but especially one involving climate change. So the opinion itself, I think, is a real step forward, but it also just illustrates how many more steps we have before us in order to really make a difference in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Knox. And I do encourage all of you to read the ICJ opinion if you have not done so yet. And I also wanted to make just a special note about also the ILW's advisory opinion that preceded it, for those of you interested in the environment. All right, moving on.
Can I just say, I should have said this, Perpetua actually represented Tuvalu before the ICJ, and so I just want to say thank you for that, and and obviously you should tell me that you should correct me if I got anything wrong. I mean, you were actually involved in the.
Oh, you're doing such a good job.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right, so moving on, we're going back to Freya, whose last name I'm terrified of saying.
Oh, don't worry, it's very long.
If you spell out, it
Oh.
works.
Does it work if you stand up?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay.
Interesting.
Oh,
And since Professor Knox, sorry, mentioned the right to education and the right to a clean and healthy environment from the ICJ advisory opinion, we'll remain on the topic of human rights. And so the next question is about Sustainable Development Goal 4. And so SDG 4 aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Every extreme weather event threatens the right to education, with SIDs and coastal nations most at risk. What can international law do to bring a binding power to this increasingly threatened SDG promise?
Thank you for the question. The first 2 points I want to make is just that the right to education fundamentally is gendered. The impacts of climate change are fundamentally gendered. And so many aspects of international law, like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the CEDAW for discrimination against women, expand upon this right to education. They expand upon the UDHR, which just says that primary education is mandatory and accessible for all, whereas the UNCRC and CEDAW recognize that primary education is simply not enough, especially for girl children. They need to have this right to be afforded beyond that. And that the second part is that the right to education doesn't matter if the schools don't exist. If the schools have been physically walked away, if they've been destroyed by hurricanes, if there's simply no longer the funds for them to be rebuilt, the right to education doesn't matter because it cannot be fulfilled. There is like I said, if we start with the UDHR, so not binding, but important. We have Article 26.1, which says that everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stage. Elementary education shall be compulsory. And what I think SDG 4 is really useful, as a really useful complementary interpretation tool, can add to the UNCRC, can add to CEDAW, can add to the EDHR, is the specific climate change impacts of education. There are certain things like in specific countries, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa region, girl children are the ones who are expected to leave school first. They're the ones who are expected to take the long treks for water. They are the ones who are experiencing period poverty, which means they can no longer go to school. And all of these things are exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. There is the wonderful UNCRC General Comment 26, and maybe I'm too positive by saying it's wonderful, but I think it's, if you have the chance to read it, it particularly talks about children and climate change, their impacts, and how they can be really the actors of change themselves. And part of that is it was actually interpreted into child-friendly language, because we're seeing such an increase in child and climate litigation that these tools are only useful if they can actually understand them, they understand their rights. So I implore you to look at that. And we also have the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education, which goes back to the fact that I'm saying the impacts fundamentally are gendered. It again, like the UDHR, insists upon mandatory primary education and asks states to make secondary education generally available and accessible to all. But we have some things like even here, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina fully or partially destroyed 110 of 126 schools in New Orleans. The city only finished its final Katrina-related school rebuilding in March 2023. Hurricane Maria, for example, caused so much damage to Puerto Rico in 2017 that 250 of its 1,100 schools shut permanently. We cannot provide equal access to education if we don't have the funds to rebuild. I know I've already said this, but it's just so devastating to see these children who want to go to school, who should have the right to go to school, but the Western states are dominating with the emissions and they are devastating their fundamental right to an education. And again, with gender impacts, like severe droughts, again, exacerbated by climate change. They plunged families into food insecurity crisis. In 2011, an extremely dry season in East Africa impacted over 1.3 million people. Many families married off their daughters in return for livestock. With few alternatives left, girl children become currency. Droughts also mean traveling long distances to fetch water, a household task primarily delegated to girl children. And when Botswana experienced soaring, drier temperatures, 70% of children who dropped out of school were girls. We also have the Racial Discrimination Convention, which may be a bit of a tenuous link here. But in Article 5, it states that states must guarantee the right of education to everyone without discrimination as to race, color, national or ethnic origin, through equality before the law, notably in the enjoyment of right to education. The consequences of climate change do not inherently discriminate on the basis of race, but just some children live in more extreme weather, more extreme weather event prone nations than others. So while this does not amount to discrimination in the law, I think it might be an interesting thing for someone much more equipped in racial discrimination and climate change to explore. And we have, of course, the ICESCR, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Article 13, which says that everyone has a right to education, primary education must be compulsory to all, secondary education shall be made generally available. It also says that it dictates states must secure within all metropolitan or other territories under its jurisdiction compulsory education, and if not, must create and adopt a plan with a reasonable timeframe for the progressive implementation of compulsory free primary education in said areas. This applies to the time period surrounding a state party becoming party to the covenant. However, if many or all schools are destroyed within an area after an extreme weather event, Article 14 may support Article 13, using Fiji as an example, a nation directly experiencing the effects of climate change, like with Cyclone Harold. The Ministry of Education reported damage to nearly 60 schools, affecting roughly 11,500 students. If these schools are not rebuilt within, quote, a reasonable number of years, according to the ICESCR, education is not available, it's not accessible, or in line with the requirements of this article. Because this only applies to states who need to secure primary education facilities at the time of ratification, this argument is not widely applicable, but something to mention. And I see I'm short on time, but I will say that CEDAW is particularly relevant again. Whilst it talks about women in the title, it does expand to girls, especially in general comments. And same with the UNCRC, it is the only convention that distinguishes between boy and girl children rather than just uses she rather than just he. And I think that's really essential here. But in sum, I think the SDGs should be used, especially for the right to education, as an interpretation tool alongside the conventions that, when published, had yet to realize the consequences of climate change, so simply hadn't included them in the text.
Thank you, Freya. And sticking to the topic of the next question is actually for Professor Knox. Sticking to the topic of human rights. SDG 16 has been called the good governance goal. It aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. How should SDG 16 be informed by international human rights law?
So I assume everyone here has some familiarity with the SDGs, and you know there's the goals, and then there's targets underneath them, and there's indicators underneath them. From the very beginning, the SDGs have been criticized for essentially ignoring human rights language, not including it and ignoring human rights standards. This is a flaw I think that runs throughout all of the SDGs, so it's especially noticeable with respect to SDG 16, which, as Rebecca said, is essentially kind of identified as the good governance SDG. The goal itself has just completely broad and general language, but it's not improved by the targets. To take just one example, target 1610 says that the target is to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. I mean, so where to even start with this? This is ensuring public access to information is certainly important. That's worthy of having its own target, but subjecting it to in accordance with national legislation is simply flatly contrary to human rights law. That's not how human rights protections work. Moreover, what do we mean by other fundamental freedoms? We can't spell them out. At the time, in 2015, the treaty body chairs have a committee, and they issued a joint statement saying that this language would be improved by explicitly referring to freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, that change was not made. So those freedoms aren't actually included. To its credit, the UN, which drafted the indicators, included as an indicator for this target the number of verified cases of killing, kidnapping, and forced disappearance, arbitrary detention and torture of journalists, etc. Basically a human rights defenders kind of indicator, which makes sense. But again, it just highlights there is no reference to human rights defenders in the target, much less the goal itself. So again, if we're talking about good governance, you're protecting the people who are protecting human rights would be important. So why isn't that included? I mean, we know why, right? States don't want to be reminded that these actually are human rights obligations as opposed to something softer that they have discretion to meet or not. Human rights sets out clearer standards. It's not that there is no discretion left whatsoever, but the idea is you're working within a legal framework. The SDGs want to avoid any suggestion that any of this is somehow required by human rights law. In this respect, again, the ICJ advisory opinion is useful contrast. There, the advisory opinion says in so many words, states have obligations to meet these climate targets, and some of those obligations are based on human rights law. It's telling, I think, that the SDGs don't include any references to this kind of simple fact, this fact about states' obligations under international law generally and human rights law in particular. I want to be clear, I'm not naive, I'm not suggesting that, maybe I am naive, but I'm not suggesting that if only there were more references to human rights and all the SDGs would be met and we'd be living in a world of butterflies and cupcakes. But I do think it's important to recognize that that is the legal framework within the SDGs should be interpreted. That is, states have real obligations here, procedural obligations with respect to the SDG 16, but also substantive obligations. I mean, in a real sense, they have obligations to try and achieve all of the substantive obligations in the SDGs. And they're just not doing that. To go back to the indicator on human rights defenders, the 2025 UN report on progress towards the SDGs says the killings and disappearances of human rights defenders remained alarmingly high in 2024, with at least 502 killings documented across 44 countries and 123 disappearances. I mean, I think this actually, I think people who work in this area would say that understates the problem, if any. I mean, I follow mainly environmental defenders, and I can tell you that there's at least 200. I mean, the official number, so to speak, is around 200 a year, but everyone recognizes the real number must be higher than that. Governments, again, have obligations to protect human rights defenders. They are often failing to meet them or even investigate their killings. Why? Because they're often complicit at some level in the killings themselves, or at least they have no real interest in trying to find out who was doing the killing. I think going forward, as we look ahead to 2030, I think advocates, scholars, people who work in this area need to be as explicit as possible, but the next set of goals need to be tied more clearly to human rights. Again, that is by no means a guarantee that they will be met, but it does tie the goals specifically to a human rights legal framework that makes clear that states have obligations to meet these goals or to do their best to meet them and aren't simply kind of doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, which I think we all agree we should not count on. Thank you.
Thank you. And last, but certainly not least, Professor Gismondi, to close out on the environment, what are the normative and practical limitations on relying on property-based reasoning to safeguard environmental rights? And how has this framework traditionally influenced the understanding and adjudication of environmental protection within the inter-American human rights system?
Yes, thank you. So this answer will give me the opportunity to complement Professor Knott's answer about the human rights-based litigation as a way or mean to pursue the environmental agenda. Because what is happening today is that claimants are relying on international human rights law and the international human rights law machinery in order to pursue their environmental complaints. And so within the human rights system, the Inter-American human rights system, the classical approach to environmental protection was to rely on the right to property. And it wasn't until 2017 that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights said, by the way, there is this right to a healthy environment enshrined in Article 26, the American Convention. But the right to a healthy environment as a right was upheld or recognized for the first time in 2017. So it's a brand new right. And prior to 2017, the environmental jurisprudence of the Inter-American human rights system rely on the right to property. And as you can see, the right to property offer environmental protection, but very limited environmental protection, because you are arguing environmental devastation or the environmental pollution or environmental destruction within the limited scope of the right to property. And what happened is that the American Convention doesn't have an explicit provision on the right to a healthy environment. And the court has recognized this right via a dynamic interpretation of Article 26. But the history of the Inter-American Court's protection of the environment has relied on the right to property. And so this is an anthropocentric framework that protects the human right to property and set aside important environmental concerns. And the right to property was basically, in the context of environmental degradation, was triggered by indigenous communities. So the environmental jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court overlaps with the claims of indigenous peoples, arguing violation of the right to property. And if one look at the cases across all the environmental cases issued by the Inter-American Court, one can see that the environmental dimension of the human rights case is not, the court doesn't pay much attention to that, but the court orders clean up the lands or mitigate the environmental harm, but the court doesn't pay enough attention to the environmental dimension. As I said in my previous presentation, that scenario has changed with the recognition of the right to a healthy environment, which I think is giving much more flexibility to the court to order remedial measures that encompasses the entire environment. So I think that recognition of the right to a safe, clean, and healthy environment is opening the doors for a stronger protection, not only within the Inter-American human rights system, but the ICJ has also asserted the existence of the right, which was recognized for the first time by the UN General Assembly back in 2020, and it's a non-binding decision of the UN, yet the ICJ is stating the right exists, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is also stating the right exists, although if you were to look the American Convention and read it carefully, it seems that it is controversial whether in fact Article 26 enshrines the right to a healthy environment, yet the court has stated it enshrines the right to a healthy environment because the American Convention is a living document. And so we need to consider all those aspects, but still I think that the Inter-American Court and courts in general, international courts, not much the European Court of Human Rights, because the European Court is reluctant to recognize the right to a healthy environment as a self-contained standard, but the Inter-American Court is a leading court together with the International Court of Justice recognizing this new right to a healthy environment, which I think can contribute to the environment and sustainable development in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I have a question for you. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the petition at the African Court of Human Rights on climate change.
The new request.
Yes.
Yes.
And I was just wondering what you think. And feel free to jump in.
Did you have the background on that case? No.
So I was just basically on the right to a healthy environment. I
Right.
just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on how they might rule on that.
So I couldn't hear what you said first, reference.
Oh,
Want to do that again?
so I was referring to the request at the African Court of Human Rights
Thank you.
on climate change and asking the professor's thoughts on how the African Court might rule on the right to a healthy environment.
So just, Giovanna has volunteered me to ask this, answer this question. Then the mic apparently doesn't agree. I'm sorry. It said, it's only gonna work for you, I guess. Oh, there it is. Okay, so just briefly, there has been a request to the African Court of Human and People's Rights, which is the regional human rights court for Africa, for an advisory opinion that would follow in the line of the Inter-American Court, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the ICJ. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights does include a right to a healthy environment, or in the language of that charter, it's a right of peoples to a satisfactory environment, which the African Commission years ago in the Ogoniland case interpreted as being basically as if it had said a right to a healthy environment. So I think people expect a pretty strong opinion from the African court. It has been a while. I mean, the African court has never really kind of tackled climate change in its litigation, but it's generally the African, I would say, human rights system is generally pretty forward-leaning on the connections between environment and human rights. And so, especially after the ICJ opinion and the Inter-American opinion, I think we'd all be pretty shocked if the African opinion was anything other than another strong opinion in that line.
Thank you so much, and sorry for the ambush. Before we take questions from the audience, for those of you who are seeking CLE credit, the code is Wellington. Wellington, like the city. Wellington. Yes. Capital letters, double L. And make sure you sign out, because you also need to sign in and sign out so that you can actually get credit. All right, so we're gonna take questions for the next few minutes. If our student ambassador could help us with the microphone. And but as you know, you might have to stand up and speak very loudly. And I will hand over my mic to the panelists and hope this works out. No questions. That's all over. We have a question on here. There's another one in the back.
So
Just
Welcome to our world.
be really, really, really loud.
not working then, I guess. I was just wondering about the SDG goals. Was there, when they set this up, the 17 goals, any consideration that climate change should have been overreaching of all of it? Because climate change is, it's getting worse and worse, and we're really not going the right way at all. That should be, it's gonna destroy most of the development goals to begin with. So I'm just wondering if there was any thought to that, and they said, no, we should make it number 13. Because it really is just another issue. And I think, especially with young people, it's the future we're talking about here, and it's not looking good.
Thank you. We'll take the other question in the back.
Okay. Yeah, okay. It might be cutting in and out. Okay. Hi, I am a 12 and currently working on a project for the right to water. Is this working? Okay, kind of. I can also project. Projecting better.
Just project anyway.
Okay, yes. I'm a quiet spoken person, soft spoken person. So, okay. Right, law student, currently working on the right to water, a couple projects related to that. Something that I've noticed in my research, especially, this is more of an Americentric question. For me, what I'm noticing is the tendency of the US economic policy, which is neoliberalism, which is to privatize, right? How that privatization, I wonder if you could speak to it on the theory with neoliberalism, right, is it's a reaction to Keynesianism, which is supposed to be a welfare state. So neoliberalism is supposed to be privatization, which is supposed to make things better and easier to actually reach these goals, is probably what the theory is. Can you speak to that? Whether you think that's valid, whether it has any merit? Because to me, what it feels like is that privatization is just going to make things worse, especially with access to the right to water. And I'm assuming if that's happening in the US, I'm not sure, and I do apologize for my ignorance on this, I'm not sure how that works globally as well. But I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. I don't know if my question.
Thank you. We'll take one more question and then we'll go to the panelists. In the back right here, second to the back, and then we'll do maybe another round if we have time.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, I'm Alex. My question is about how the UN is looking forward from the Sustainable Development Goals, because 2030 is not that far away. So the Pact for the Future, which was sort of voted on this year, 2025, the first goal of the Pact for the Future, the first section is about sustainable development. I'm wondering if, there was a lot of negotiation, and a lot of states really had a lot to say about the sort of nitty-gritty of it, maybe expecting that there would be more concrete obligations after the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts about how the UN system, the General Assembly, sort of writ large, is thinking about sustainable development more concretely in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So panelists.
Let's start with you.
Sure.
Whoever wants to take it.
So, does this one work? Can you hear me?
I think
This
we
is
need the
working?
mic.
Yeah.
Do you want this one back?
How about?
Okay.
Thanks.
I don't know what to be.
Okay, all right. So, I think I'm gonna take on the right to water privatization question. So as a factual matter, I think there is reason to doubt that privatization kind of cures all ills or anything like that, but just the point I'm gonna focus on is just as a matter of international human rights law. Human rights law keeps the obligations on states, no matter what states do. So states can't say, well, we no longer have an obligation with respect to water or sanitation because we privatized that. So if they do privatize it, they still are responsible as a matter of international human rights law for showing that they are actually meeting the standards that they have to meet. If they privatize and are not meeting the standards, then obviously that's a problem. But if they don't privatize and are not meeting the standards, then that's a problem too. So from that perspective, human rights law is kind of almost agnostic in a way on whether you privatize, it's whether it works or not. Again, factually, I think a lot of people would say there's reason to highly question whether privatization really has worked. On the climate change question, it's kind of the overarching thing. I guess I would just point out, I mean, obviously I agree that climate change does have the likelihood of undermining all of the other development goals. But at the same time, remember that there are billions of people living right now without access to clean water, clean sanitation. Air pollution kills around 7 million people a year right now. So I don't think it's unreasonable for the drafters of the Sustainable Development Goals to prioritize ending hunger, for example, SDG 2 in the next 15 years, ending extreme poverty, SDG 1 in the next 15 years. I don't think that's an unreasonable decision. So it's not, to me, it's not a matter of which Sustainable Development Goal is the most important one. They all kind of they all depend on each other, they all depend on progress across the board. And I don't have any real insights about what's going to happen next. So I'm sorry about that.
Oh, sure. Okay, let's try standing. It's deeply inconsistent, that's okay. There was a really interesting piece in Transnational Environmental Law by Neve Gurry and IAMH. Who she asks, why do states follow the Sustainable Development Goals as they are like an ethical agenda rather than international law or any binding instrument? And I think that's just for everyone here a really interesting piece to read. I have to say, as an international law scholar, I think what is next is more international law, is more instruments being cited and interpreted as human rights abuses or as fundamental human rights as impacted by climate change, even if the text itself hadn't anticipated the impacts of climate change. I think we'll get more general comments because those are coming all the time. I think the big meetings like the World Future Council and everything about future generations will be huge for post 2030. But I am particularly intrigued to see what happens with global consensus, climate change, and the United States. Because international law simply isn't a tool that's effective here. So I don't know what's next for the United States as a major emitter, as a major polluter in the world of international law in this current administration. But what I also hope is next is more litigation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sabin Center's tracking. If you're particularly interested in climate change litigation, University College Cork has a wonderful tracker for everything children are doing. So I think more litigation, more advisory opinions are probably brought by groups most impacted who are finally being given a voice. And hopefully these advisory opinions will inspire a lot of people to use the world courts as they are designed to be. But specifically, what is after 2030? I don't know. I just have to be hopeful.
Thank you, Freya. We'll do a second round, but we have less than 5 minutes, so short questions. And we'll start here.
Hello, my name is Melody. I'm here from the Human Rights Institute in Georgetown. My question is about sort of the future or aftermath of the ICJ advisory opinion, and thinking about potential contentious cases that could come after that, and whether you all think those might be effective, given that many of the major emitters are not subject to general compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ, how contentious cases might be able to be used to build on what the advisory opinion has already done.
Thank you, Melody. We'll go over here.
I can just talk. I'm Paul Goodwin. I work for the Green Climate Fund. Nice to see you. We talked a couple months ago on the phone. My question is about how one might use these ICJ opinions and the emergence of this international law to influence American and other laws related to fiduciary duties of investment fund managers. Right now, there's obviously this back and forth between administrations as to whether pension managers and investment managers can consider the impact of environmental considerations in their investments, and it goes back and forth. And I'm wondering if this could be a tool here or elsewhere for in litigation to force fund managers to consider environmental considerations, because it's kind of a group action problem. So yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you so much. And that will be the last question. I'm so sorry, but we want to give the panelists time to answer the questions, but you can catch them afterwards.
Yeah. So I want to clarify or emphasize the fact that most climate change litigation today takes place before national courts. So 80% of litigation on climate change is litigated before national courts. And if we were to consider national courts, a major percentage of climate change litigation takes place in the United States. And another good percentage of climate change litigation takes place in Europe. So that's the first aspect that we have to keep in mind, is that only a few climate change litigation cases reach the international level. The Human Rights Committee has decided the first climate change case in Torres Islands versus Australia, where we found that Australia violated the right to culture of the islanders. And then the European Court of Human Rights also has heard cases on climate change, and upheld the first case in Climate Seniors versus Switzerland, pursuant to the right to privacy and family life. And so, as you can see, it's relying on civil and political rights of the Human Rights Treaty to uphold fundamental human rights in the context of climate change. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has not heard a case on climate change. The Inuit case was the first case, but it was rejected at the very outset in 1985. So I just want to make sure that I clarify that I think that these advisory opinions of the ICJ and the two advisory opinions amendments of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I think that they will have impact in domestic laws and policies, especially where civil law countries integrate international law into domestic law. And so I think that in the case in particular of the Inter-American Court, the courts across Latin America and Central America will consider advisory opinion 32 of 2025 concerning climate change.
We have less than a minute, if anyone wants to add anything.
The only thing I was gonna add is in response to your question, and I totally agree with everything Joanna said. I think that ICJ advisory opinion should be seen as part of a much broader constellation of litigation. And that litigation too should be seen as a broader constellation of fixed risk factors for investors. And so as investors start factoring in increased risk of litigation into the additional kinds of risks that they're looking at as a result of climate change, in that sense, I think the ICJ advisory opinion will have an accelerant effect, but I don't want to overstate. It's not like by itself going to make all the difference, but as part of this broader constellation, yeah, it's now the microphone decides to work. It's perfect. So
Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you for your very intriguing questions. And we're out of time. So thank you for being here.